Today's date is December 30th, 2025. I'm here in the Chimczuk Museum with Chris Edwards. Before we get into the questions, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Chris Edwards. I'm the owner and publisher at Walkerville Publishing in Windsor, Ontario, founded in 1999. So we celebrated our 25th anniversary last year.
And congrats. Yeah. So as we are doing this recording, Chris Edwards' exhibit, A River Runs Between Us, is currently on display at the Chimczuk Museum. And that is also simultaneously with a new book along with Elaine Weeks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the book and the exhibit. Can you talk about the process of researching, writing, compiling text, selecting photos, and other steps that you and Elaine needed to do to complete the book?
Sure. When we started into local history in 1999, we launched a publication called the Walkerville Times, and initially it was just going to be about Walkerville, but what we found out was Walkerville was very historic. So we hit the history market at a time when it was transitioning from the old-fashioned way of doing research to the new way, which would be internet-based. And we watched the progression from being very difficult to find stories and images online, very low-resolution photos, to the point now where you can access archives, research, newspapers going back to the beginning. For instance, the Detroit Free Press is online, goes back to 1848. You can look at every one of the issues of the New York Times. There are a massive amount of archives online. So our process moved. We're not trained as historians, but we were both trained at the university, so we learned how to work with card catalogs and with microfiche and with old school audio and video, film stock, going from that and transitioning to the digital world, which is really a lot better. So our process has evolved. And when we started on this book, it was a process of going through our previous books and figuring out what we had already resourced as stories we had written about Windsor, Detroit, because every book we did at that point, I think we were at 8 books in, had stories about Windsor and had stories about Detroit. So we went through all of that, and that was a big challenge. And because we did 61 issues of the Walkerville Times as well. Plus, we did books for other people. We were on contract. For instance, we did a book on the history of Italians in Windsor. We worked with Madeline from the museum on that project. So we had a lot of stuff. But, it's kind of like, where is it all? We had to bring it all into one folder, I guess the best way to do it. And then from there, we got into the deep research in the archives, and because it was a 7-year process, we took our time with this book. We really went slow on it, and watched, during COVID, when we were stuck at home, we watched as more and more archives opened up because they wanted people to have access from home, and then people started working from home. And that opened up even greater opportunities for us to do research. So a 7-year process to put this book together was quite involved.
One thing I learned about, even the process of just getting to the point of the book, is that you and Elaine, you two did an exhibit at the Art Speak Gallery in Walkerville. And it was an interesting kind of step because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you two didn't even realize that, people are asking for the book. It's like, where is the book? I was kind of curious. Did you do that with your other books too, having a gallery show prior to, or?
We had, so here's what happened, Walter. You asked about the process. So we had, I think, 3 or 4 titles in inventory, and they weren't really selling that great. They're selling slow, a slow buck, I call it. But, I went in the warehouse, and I could see all these pallets of books, and Elaine and I sat down, and we brainstormed, okay, what can we do to sell books? So we said, well, you know what, we don't have a proper storefront because we work out of our house. So let's go to the Art Speak Gallery, which we're members of, and let's rent that at Christmas. So we'll rent that space, and now we'll have a pop-up store in Walkerville, which Walkerville, you know, is a very hot little shopping district. So now we got a pop-up store. So what are we going to do? And we walked in, we looked at the walls, and the wall was kind of, there was like two walls like a shotgun, you know, meaning like they're really deep, not very wide. And we said, wow. And I don't even know, like the way Elaine and I work, we're kind of like one brain. So the one brain said, wow, maybe we can have like Detroit on one side, Windsor on the other, and we'll have this symbolic river down the middle. And we should call it A River Runs Between Us. So we curated this exhibit. Each wall, very long, a lot of images, and every image on the one side had to connect to the other side. And it was a great success. So much so that we did it the next year. We had an exhibit, and that was called Windsor Before and After. And we showed how the city has transitioned over time. The same building, two photos, not then and now, because a lot of the buildings are gone, but say 100 years ago and 50 years ago. So that became a really great venue for us to sell books. And then after that, COVID hit. So the process was, as you said, people were coming in to look at this River Between Us exhibit, and they kept saying, well, where's the book? We said, well, we got these books over here. No, the River Between Us book. Well, you know, once about 100 people ask you the same question, you think, oh, I must have something here. So then we got into the process of doing the book, and as I said, it came in starts and stops because we did the before and after book after that, and then we did Brood in Windsor. So we did two books in between A River Runs Between Us. And then we stopped during COVID, we got discouraged, and then we thought, oh my God, you know, these books are expensive to produce, and it's a lot of work, and, you know, not a great return. Is it worth it? So we got this, you know, you get discouraged. So we got discouraged and we stopped doing it. And then one day, you know, I kept hearing this voice, you have to do this book, you know, it's like haunting me. So then we finally got serious about it, and probably a year and a half of real intense work on it, because it's a massive project. You've seen the book. It's 400 pages, 1,200 photos. We really wanted it to be something that's going to stand the test of time. So that was our process, long answer to a short question.
Yeah, and kudos, yes. Really detailed, really thorough. Since, we have the exhibit, A River Runs Between Us, at the Chimczuk Museum, can you talk a little bit about that adaptation process? What was that like? You know, I'm assuming you probably already had the book in its final form. Did you just adapt like those items for like exhibition, viewing, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were in the throes of getting ready to launch, and one of the things I always wanted to do, and we had an exhibit here when it was the art gallery on Albert Kahn. So we looked at Albert Kahn's influence in Windsor and then in the world, the great architect. And we have had a great relationship with the staff here at the museum, very close to Madeline in particular. As I said, we worked on a book together. And so I approached Madeline with the idea a long time ahead, because I know these things have to get slotted and programmed. So early this year, maybe even last year, I can't, everything's blurry. And I said, and so I met with her and with Craig, and I just wanted to hatch the idea. What's the idea? Can we do this? And they were very enthusiastic, because it's, we didn't realize how timely the exhibit was going to be with the politics of the world. We just thought it's a really neat story. So we met with them, and then we looked at the space, and the space dictates what we can do. So I started working very closely with Craig, a lot of meetings. He's a great curator to work with. And so we looked at the space, and I said, well, what's our limitations in terms of panels? So he gave me the dimensions that were the limitations that you could output here, because we didn't want to run into extra costs. You can always go crazy and spend money externally, but I wanted to stay within what was realistic. And then, so we looked at the space, then we looked at what size the panels could be, as big as they could be. And then that gave me the inspiration to, okay, so what I'm going to do for this specific exhibit is I'm going to contrast everything on the panel is going to be Windsor, Detroit. Whereas in the book, sometimes it flows Windsor and Detroit, sometimes it'll just flow Detroit, then just Windsor. But we tried to make it 50-50, but sometimes the story is needs more to tell on one side than on the other. But this one was specifically going to be 50-50, Windsor and Detroit. And we came up with that we could get away with 32 panels. So I completely redesigned the panels so that they would not be, they don't look like the book. Okay, the book has a certain design to it, but the panels are different in that they're split right down the middle. Sometimes in the book they go from one page to the other. Sometimes they go down the middle. It just, they cross over. So, and then we had to pick 32 themes. So I gave a list to Craig, and he said, well, what's nice about you giving me the list is now I can look for artifacts in the museum that we can fill cabinets with, which is great as well. So that was the process of choosing, and then I came up with this idea that the top of the panel should have a Canadian-American flag, for instance, which doesn't really appear in the book. And then just the treatment, we had to condense the text, and they worked really great. I mean, we worked hand in glove on condensing the text, making sure it worked, because an exhibit on the wall is different than in a book. So we curated it a bit different, and then when it was done, I was so thrilled. Oh, honest to God. And what's amazing about Walter is that we get to look at Detroit when we're in the exhibit room. I mean, that you can't make that stuff up. Literally, if you open a window, the river does run between us right outside the exhibit. So that whole thing is like, the whole concept of serendipity, when things come together naturally, you don't force it. And everything comes together, and it just was really a thrilling project to be involved in. It just had this really good vibe all the way through. I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, it's great.
A long
Thanks.
way there.
So I got some, maybe more specific questions, like from looking through the book and whatnot.
Sure.
Like, for example, I thought the illustration of Hudson's was incredible. Looks like the inside of a beehive. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, like, really kind of drilling down which illustrations and historic photographs that ultimately people see in the book and the exhibit.
Yeah, that's a really great one that you found. So, again, back to this whole digital archive thing. Now, that was done in Life magazine, that exhibit. Now, Life magazine, when I grew up, was a really important magazine, and that disappeared. But thankfully, somebody had the wherewithal to archive every Life magazine. So in doing my research, and what you do when you research something like this, Walter, is you're looking for the gold nuggets. So you're going through, it's like panning for gold. You're going through all of this material. And then when you see something, it's almost like a praise the Lord moment. And that, when I found that one, I couldn't believe that building, that exhibit at Hudson's. Turned out it was like a 20-page story. Life or Look. It might even be Look magazine, It's one of those two. And there was a story on Hudson's, because Hudson was the tallest department store in the world, second biggest department store in the world by square footage. And then there was the whole story of Hudson's. So now, again, to the serendipity, the more you pay attention, the more things come your way. I saw something, don't ask me where, that they were having an exhibit at the Dearborn Museum on Hudson's. And I went there, and I found the guy who has everything to do with Hudson's. His collection is absolutely mind-boggling. So he had all these photos, which he was willing to share. Then he tells me about a guy who had all the keys to the Hudson building when it closed.
Wow.
So I go to his place, and he's got stuff. He tells me about a guy who's got a collection of Detroit stuff. This is when I was working on the Detroit book. So I started really, for that book, and it was the same as we did with Windsor's, I tried to find the people who collect the stuff. The people are trying, are trying to keep this stuff alive, and they have saved it, and they become freaks. There's a guy, for instance, who has Werner stuff. He has this house full of Werners. I met a guy who had a Stroh's collection, Stroh's beer collection, that he just sold for $500,000 because it was so rare. But he was not doing it for the money. He was doing it to save it. And then at the end, what happens? Like I always say, when I met collectors, I always ask them the same question. What's going to happen to your collection when you die? Do you have a plan? You know? And so I'll give you, I know we're going a little off topic, but a gentleman calls me and he says, I have 10,000 negatives of the city of Windsor. And I'm like, what in the world? So I got to go see this guy. And I go see him and he says, look, I worked in the police department, and the police department had archives, photos. And when they tore the police building down, they were going to destroy them all. So I took some time and I saved 10,000 images, negatives. So it starts from 1945. Unfortunately, he didn't save, they had already destroyed everything pre-1945, which is a shame because I imagine. And what they did was, every time a building had a break-in, any time a building had a police incident, or any time there was an accident on the street, they would take photos, sometimes from 4 angles. So they didn't know that they were documenting Windsor as archivists. They thought they were documenting crime, but it turned out they were documenting Windsor, especially in the 50s when all the changes happened, when they tore down a lot of the built heritage. So I said to Mike Skreptiak was his name, he was a retired cop. I said, what are you going to do with this stuff when you die? He says, you know, my kids don't like that I did this my whole life. They're not going to want anything to do with it. I said, I'll tell you what, why don't I hook you up with the university? They had a bunch of students, scan them all. So they're all digitized. I says, the only thing I would ask is that they be in the public domain and that they be high res. So that's the SWOT archives. That is how that came about. And just, you know, how do you find this stuff? You find these collectors. These guys are freaks. You know, I say that in a nice way. I don't mean that in a negative way. There's one guy, for instance, he collects buttons. You think, oh, that's kind of weird. Well, they got a button for everything back in the day. You know, another guy collects matchbooks. So I get to meet all these characters in my travels. And that's half the stuff that I really enjoy is these guys are real characters. You know, they always are. And they're really kind of worried about their collection all the time. So I had this whole thing where I would go to their house with my laptop and my scanner. And I would not take the stuff. Before we had the Walkerville Times, people would bring it to me, and I'd always be worried that we're going to lose something or something's going to happen. I'd scan that stuff so fast and get it back to them. You guys know what it's like around here. I'm sure stuff comes in all the time. So that was kind of like another part of the process of getting this book together. So researching, and now we'll jump right into how do you take these images and make them printable. So what we did was we learned early on how to take bad images and upscale them. So take them from low res to high res. So we learned a bunch of tricks about that, and it was complicated. And a lot of times when you get into newspaper is a low res medium, but when you get into books, crappy photos look crappy no matter what you do. The good news is people don't expect historical photos to be perfect. It's not like a, you know, high-end photo book from, you know, who's a famous photographer. I can't think of one at the moment, but, you know, Ansel Adams. His books are magnificent, you know, silver gel, and, you know, they didn't expect them to be that great. So what we did in this book, because we were getting so good at upscaling, we decided to start colorizing them. So we took these black and white images, and when you colorize them, they just come to life. So how do you do that? Well, colorization became a real trend. I found a woman imbued with hues when I was doing the Detroit book, and I found her, and I hired her to do some color work for me. She was like an artist, honest to God. She would painstakingly airbrush these photos like they used to airbrush postcards to make them color back in the day. And so then I thought, well, maybe I can learn how to do it. so I started learning how to use Photoshop, and it was kind of complicated. You know, you have to create these layers, and you have to really keep your act together and what you're doing. And I found it very difficult, but it was COVID. So I started playing with these color images hours and hours. It's just kind of goofy. You know, you get obsessed with something, and you just start. So I colorized, I'd say 99% of the black and white images that are in the book were turned into color. By looking at other examples of images, say of a street scene. Okay, what's that brick building? Well, what color is that brick? I'm gonna select that color, and I'm gonna paint the building. So we got into that, and now this is the part that just blows my mind. So we're done the book. We've done all this work on colorization, and I think you've seen them. They came out pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. But Google comes out with Nano Banana. And Nano Banana, you take a black and white photo and you pop it in Nano Banana and you tell it to colorize it, and it's mind-boggling. So I've started putting some of those up on social media to get comments. At first, people were really attacking it. It's AI. It's the end of the world. I said, no, man, this is a cool tool. And so we went from, again, we watched the transition from, I had a graphic designer that was really good at colorizing. It was almost like he was doing paintings. He was an artist, Chuck Reese, and he would do for the Walkerville Times. I specifically remember this one of a billboard in World War II where these two soldiers are sitting, and there's this ad behind, and he's colorized it, and it's amazing. It looks like a work of art. So I watched how Chuck did it, and I thought, man, that guy's got mad skills. I started doing it. Now it's all going to be done with the AI. It's kind of shocking how good the AI is, honest to God. And the upscaling now, there's a tool called Topaz. I mean, it doesn't matter, but it'll take a really crappy photo and it'll upscale it to the point where you could actually do a billboard. You know, it's crazy what's happening. So we've watched the transition from analog to digital with scanning, and now you can actually, just to give you another example of something that we did, the Herald Press, the owners of Herald Press, they closed Herald Press. They've been around for 125 years. And he had these wood blocks. And what they used to do is take a wood block and put a copper plate on it, and they'd etch the copper plate as a negative, and then they'd put ink on it, and that's how they would print photos. So he had this box full of these wood blocks. So I found out there's this organization, like co-op in Detroit, that collects old printers. Long story, but my buddy, I said, do you know anybody who knows anything about the wood blocks? And he says, there's these guys in Detroit. So I went over and I sat with them and I showed them the wood blocks, and they were freaking out. They love this stuff. He says, you know what? If you put talcum powder on it, it'll show up. So I put talcum powder on it, and I tried to scan it, and it wouldn't scan. It was too pixely. So then I thought, well, how about if I take a photo with my phone? This is mind-boggling. Took a photo with my phone, okay, put it into Nano Banana and told it to colorize it, and the results are absolutely mind-boggling. The fire of 1849, the Windsor fire of 1849, I don't know if you saw that one on social media. I popped up, and it is incredible. So the transition now from, I got into digital in 1985, okay, digital publishing. And at that time, all I ever heard from people is how terrible it is and blah, blah, blah. You don't want to be doing digital publishing. All the traditional ways of doing publishing, all gone. It's all digital now. Now we're moving into this new AI phase where photography and digital design is going to be done by a robot, which is kind of mind-boggling, really. I mean, I'm already been in touch with people. They're really getting into doing books. They haven't quite matured to the photo books yet, but you want to get a book done, you can use AI to do your book. So that's the transition. I'm like a living guy who came from the old way, embraced the new way, and now I'm watching this next wave. And to me, AI reminds me of when the personal computers came in, what a big shift that was. Everybody has a personal computer now. And if you don't have one on your desk, you got one in your hand, right? I mean, everybody. So this is where we're at. I don't even know if I answered the question. See what happens? I go off like a squirrel. I get off on tangents.
No, you're doing good. Thank you. So I was kind of curious about, I think it's fair to say there's some historical stories in Windsor, people may be more familiar with than others. And then, we could sit here all day and talk about them.
Oh, I could. You know me. Once I start, I never met a microphone I didn't like.
So, for example, in the book, for example, stories about Boblo and Prohibition, and then you have lesser well-known tales such as the Louis Pesha Postcard Company.
Wow, that's a good one.
And even civil rights champion Sarah E. Ray.
Yeah.
So I was just kind of curious about even the placement of these lesser well-known stories amongst the more well-known stories.
Good for you. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question again, because I find the lesser stuff, to me, it's all a big puzzle. So we could tell the story of Martin Luther King. Everybody knows the story of Martin Luther King. Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but that's a big brand. If you're going to talk about stories as brands, like what's recognizable, I think a brand as being recognizable. We know about Rosa Parks and her protests, but Sarah Ray really intrigued me, and I was trying to get a balance in the emancipation chapter between the big stories and the small ones, because a lot of times it's the little people that make things happen. And her protest with the Boblo boat, being denied entry on the Boblo boat, and how she protested that and won, is an amazing story. And like the other story that I didn't put in the book that is amazing is Ozian Sweet, and the book The Arc of Justice. It's a story about Detroit and how this black man tried to move into a neighborhood and everybody was so against him. They literally tried to burn his house down, and how he fought and how they won the civil rights case. That's Detroit again. So, little story that's actually a big story in the scheme of the world. And, when you talk about Louis Pesha, great story. I love Louis Pesha. And what happened was, when we were doing our book, Postcards in the Past, I started looking at these photos. David Newman had this unbelievable collection of postcards, like incredible. Again, we talk about these collectors. This guy was so passionate about postcards. And I looked at these postcards and said, these look like street scenes. Have you ever heard of Vivian Marr, the photographer? You know how they found her collection in all these storage units, and her street scenes were phenomenal. She just had the eye. This guy was like that, but this is like 1900. I'm looking at these street scenes, and I said to David, these are remarkable. He says, oh, these postcards are worth a fortune. Louis Pesha was a guy who started doing postcards. He was a Canadian guy who ended up in Marine City, Michigan, which is on Lake St. Clair. So I started looking into Louis Pesha, and sure enough, his stuff is mind-boggling. The street scene, he didn't know, I don't know what he was doing, but he was not shooting what you would call regular postcards. And he happened to be in Windsor a lot, in Walkerville. So he's done, not a ton, but a lot. A lot of his stuff got lost, unfortunately. He had a fire. So here's a great story of Louis Pesha, and that's an exhibit I really want to do. I would love to do an exhibit on Louis Pesha. So I'm looking around at, Detroit, Windsor. He was in Marine City, and what he would do is take a photo of every boat that went by in like 1905. So he was like one of the first guys to start a postcard publishing company, because postcards were used to communicate with somebody. So you'd send a postcard, hi Walter, how you doing? Can we meet tomorrow at 3? And you'd send me one back, because they didn't have phones yet. So postcards were used like as a phone call. And they would be delivered same day or next day. So there were thousands, millions of postcards going all over. Some of them got saved. That's a way that we can preserve our built history. We can see street scenes. So there's street scenes in Windsor. Louis Pesha did street scenes in Detroit. I was not able to really do much on him in this book, but I wanted to honor him because he was one of the first. And then you say, okay, that's Louis Pesha, Canadian, but what do we have? Well, you have the Detroit Publishing Company across the river, and they went all over the world documenting the world. They were one of the first ones to do color. postcards by hand, kind of like using, pre-Photoshop. They would paint the cards so that they see through. They came up with a whole method, and man, their collection is unbelievable. Turns out their collection resides in Dearborn at the Henry Ford, half of it, and the other half is on the Library of Congress website for free, high res, like super high res, like the size of a wall high res, like 300 meg files, if anybody knows what the hell I'm talking about. Excuse me. So, small story, but these guys are pioneers in something that became pretty common, which was photography. The Detroit Publishing Company is so cool that they had a train car custom built with a photo lab in it. Wow. So when they were in the road, they could take photos and process them right away. And I found that photo of their train car and I colored it in the book.
Cool.
So that's cool. Louis Pesce died in a car crash in 1908. Who knows where he would have gone? But he was from a town near, see, my brain's not quite on, near, what's the oil town in Ontario? Oil Springs, or there's a...
Close to Sarnia, right?
Close to Sarnia, north of Sarnia. So he was going to Sarnia and going across the river, and that's how he ended up in Marine City. So he would go, he mostly did Windsor, Detroit River, downriver, Toledo. That was kind of like his turf, and all towns in between. So a lot of cool train stations, a lot of street scenes, and then he would do weird things like put an airplane flying through the street. They kind of paste it into place. So he was a cool guy. I love this story, and I think he's worthy of an exhibit, probably worthy of a small book. And so as it happens, Walter, I doing my thing and doing research, and all of a sudden I find out that the guy has a collection in Ann Arbor of Louis Pesce's, all the stuff that exists in the world, which is cool, like originals too.
Wow.
So, and he's donated that to a museum. So, wow, on and on it goes, right? Never ends. This stuff, it never ends.
Yeah. Also, I was curious about, were there any history books that, you and Elaine were inspired by towards the creation of this book? I was thinking about, there's the Ferry Steamers book by William Oxford, Long Road by Charlotte Bront Perry, Rum Runners, Marty Gervais, Border City Powerhouse, Pat Broad.
All of those. We lean more towards the photo book. Our way of telling history is through photos. You'll notice in the book there are not any long stories. I think the longest one is the Pesce Island one, which is 4 pages. We lean to photo story. So we're more drawn to the photo history books. So the big ones that inspire, that you kind of try to reach that level. It's there's a book called Dreamland America, which is a collection of the Library of Congress Detroit Publishing Company photos. Mind-boggling. I love that stuff. It's all like, they call it Dreamland because did all this stuff really happen? Because most of it's gone. I love that one. It's a black and white book. If you talk about the books that I love, I really like Roadside America. Now I can't think of his name. He's a photographer that went around and did mid-century America kitsch, like giant dinosaurs and, all the stuff that was by the roadside in America. And I love his photography because he never had any people or cars in the photo. It was always just whatever the roadside attraction was. And he went all over America. And it turns out his collection was in Dearborn, right? So again, I'm back to Dearborn and I'm back to the archives, and then I find out that the Library of Congress released all his stuff. I can't remember his name. Isn't that terrible? A book like that. The Buildings of Detroit. Hawkins Ferry. His dad and his grandfather founded the Ferry Seed Company, which was a Windsor, Detroit company, and they were the first company to put seeds in packages so people could have small gardens. Before, seeds were just for farmers. But people started moving into cities more, came up with this idea of having seeds in packages. They were the first company in the world to do it. And Hawkins Ferry was the son, so he had stupid money. So he decides he's going to do a book and document every building in Detroit in 1950s. Phenomenal book. What a project. The thing weighs like about 40 pounds. It's a big book, It's very aspirational to do all that kind of work. And then there's other volumes where you just say, wow, look at the work here. There's the Detroit Almanac by the Detroit Free Press. Just absolutely mind-boggling, the research that went into that. I mean, those guys were so passionate. You can feel the passion when you read it. In Windsor, we're kind of living in the golden era of local history books. First, obviously, I like to toot my own horn, but the 10 books we've done, they're more part of a whole compact, like a whole story. And, you do the Biblioasis books on the Windsor Star. Very important that those 2 volumes were published with all those great photos. Marty Gervais doing the Rum Runners. What timing. Those guys are all dead now. Marty had the sense to go out and interview these guys. So what we call oral history, very important. Like I always say, they might not all be true, the stories, but they sure are interesting. And you take that as like probably one of the classic Windsor book stories. Then you have the similar stories in Detroit, the Purple Gang books. My buddy Greg Fournier wrote a book on the Purple Gang. The whole Prohibition thing, just wild. So a lot of great books. I have a really nice collection of, I collect local history books. So, but now it's almost getting to the point where there's been so many books published, it's hard to keep up. It really is hard to find a place for all these books. So we're really living in a golden era of local history books, I think, in Windsor. And now I fear that books are going to really start to fall by the wayside as the AI takes over. It's going to be harder and harder to sell a book. That's the problem. It's not hard to do them, but it's hard to sell them, to make money on it. So, yeah. But again, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. Like the Ambassador Bridge, the Windsor-Detroit Tunnel, and Gordie Howe, a river runs between us, connects the ongoing relationship Windsor and Detroit has since their inception by showing both cities' histories simultaneously, both in the book and the exhibit. Can you talk a little bit about that approach to showcase basically both? And for example, in the book, you have pages of Walkerville following sections of Detroit's hot stove and lumber barons. Of course, we could also reference exhibit items too.
So, if you look from outer space, you actually do see a border here. A lot of times you don't see a border. Like the border between Canada and the U.S. is mostly imaginary. But the Great Lakes do form a border. The history of it is kind of unique in that when they looked at the river actually it starts by heading west and then it turns south. So it's very unusual when they carved it up. So we looked at this area as one area. We didn't look at it as 2 areas. So when we did the research, when we went back far enough, we realized, it was one area. First you have the First Nations, Aboriginal people, and again, that goes through transition. You talk about the mound builders, people who build all these mounds, they don't know much about them. And then you move into the various groups, tribes, I call it. It's not politically correct anymore, evidently, but I think tribe as a group of people, like-minded peoples, So they come in and they have a whole way of life that really doesn't get told in history very well. It's always like Cadillac came here and that's how Detroit was founded. No, there were people here. Right, and in fact, because of those people, that the area was able to get settled, in fact, because they never would have made it on their own, these settlers. Excuse me. So then you transition to the missionaries. The missionaries come in, and they've got, the word missionary, they have a mission. It's not just religion, it's also trade. Right, so you have the Hudson Bay Company coming in. Then you have the coming, like I like to say, the coming of the white man. That's the history that we're taught. So Cadillac comes to town, but it's not two places, it's one place. Cadillac settles on the Detroit side, but they immediately set up shop at Assumption Church, which is now one of the second oldest sites in Canada, really, historically. Like when they come down the river, they're coming down here for a reason. They're looking for fur, right? And then everything else, the abundance. It was an abundant universe back then. You know, the trees, the mining, the fish, you know, everything, the hunting. So they come here and they settle. That's French. Okay, that's French at first. Then you have the British. They come in. Now you start to go at each other, and we have a series of wars, right? And then things get settled. About 1837 is the last time somebody died cross-border battle. Now you get into business, and that's what you allude to. Now things are completely different when you get into business. We've got a dividing line between the two, but we're only divided by the water. So now we have to find ways to cross. You mentioned the bridge, the tunnel. That's later, but originally it's all boats. So we figure out how to start doing trade. And we don't really see it as two places. We see it as one place. So whatever starts to happen in Detroit benefits Windsor. The big deal is the automotive. When that starts happening, but Detroit's already making stoves. They're already making train cars. Detroit is a manufacturing center. They're making steel. One of the first places in America to make steel was Detroit, not Pittsburgh. So they're making steel. All of a sudden, things start booming with the automotive. Really, that was like, things were going well in the 1800s, but man, when the cars came, that was a big game changer. Well, Henry Ford, who is the big name, but there were other car manufacturers, and they look at Windsor and say, that's the British market. The British market is huge. The sun never sets on the British Empire. We can sell into the empire. We can make a lot of money. So they come to Windsor and they start manufacturing here so they can avoid tariffs, which is really cool because we've got a tariff issue now. Oh, yeah. So they avoid tariffs by setting up in Windsor. Well, guess what? Windsor becomes the motor city. Detroit's the motor city. Windsor becomes the motor city. So that's just one story of how connected we are. And that changed the world. Okay, automotive changed the world. Henry Ford especially changed the world. But there were other guys. There was William Durant, there's all, David Buick and, all of these great names that we know. Walter Chrysler. Windsor's still a Chrysler town. All because of Detroit. And they never saw the border as an impediment. They always saw it as an opportunity. And a lot of people in Windsor still feel that way. The border's an opportunity, not an impediment. I mean, Windsor thrives because of Detroit, because of its location. I mean, that's why we put how many billion-dollar bridge in. It's opportunity, always opportunity in Windsor. And that's how we should always look at each other. Right now, we're debating that opportunity, which, is unfortunate, but it happens. I mean, we fought wars. It's not like this is something that it should be unexpected. People want to protect their side, but we're better off when we work together. So that's just one example. We figured out that there were at least 6 examples of how Windsor, Detroit changed the world. The car being the big one. So, yeah, I mean, every time somebody opens up a shop in Detroit back, 100 years ago, they're always looking at Windsor saying, we got to have a shop in Windsor. And look what happened. Windsor just benefited so much from our relationship. And even today, we have a development commission. We've got this battery plant here. Well, the reason why we got this battery plant, big reason, is because of our location. It gives us access to America. I mean, that bridge is the busiest crossing in the world, in North America, because of opportunity. Where we are located, geography. It's perfect. So, yeah. I don't know if that gets you there, but I mean, obviously there's a lot of other examples. I could give you one more that I absolutely love, is the CKLW, and how somebody figured out, look, if we can do this right, we can set up in Windsor, and we can convince everybody in Detroit that we're a local station, that we're not from Canada. We're going to pretend we're American, and we're going to broadcast the best music in the world, which happens to be Motown. And other stations were not playing Motown music at the time. And they started playing Motown music, but even better, than like CKLW, WKNR Keener, they were both kind of had a similar format. They were feeding off each other as this thing got popular, the Motown music, especially Detroit rock and roll too, but I'm more focused on Motown. And then all of a sudden, CKLW gets the bright idea of doing a TV show and getting the Motown bands over. Well, the Motown bands were not appearing on TV at the time. So Berry Gordy was in love with Robin Seymour. And Robin Seymour had every Motown act do a lip sync, pretending to be live, a dance show, our version of American Bandstand. And guess what? Motown went crazy. I mean, in the 60s, Motown went absolutely, I think there was 110 acts I read somewhere, at least, from Motown that were popular, not more than that beyond. And every one of them played lip sync that CKLW. How did that change the world? You ask any artist, did Motown have an influence on you? The Beatles, let's take the big ones, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who. You take those bands, they all say the same thing. We love Motown. So that changed the world. And this station became the number 4 station in North America because of its reach and because of its format.
And to your point earlier about how this, there's so many, sure, we have the actual border with U.S. and Canada, but to your point about Motown, I mean, you had Stevie Wonder and the Supremes cutting their teeth at the Jackson Park Band Shell for the Emancipation Celebration. So, it's another example of this, sure, we have a border, but we're so connected, Well,
that's a great point you just made, because that now ties back to that's pre-CKLW. We have the greatest freedom festival in the world, the Emancipation Day Festival, where up to 200,000 people came to Windsor for this festival to celebrate freedom. And they had the band shell, and who were they playing? They were playing like really young Stevie Wonder, really young Diana Ross. Everybody played it, and before that, Jackie Wilson, little Walter, I can't remember his name. But they were playing there. And this festival was massive deal. It was a big deal. Martin Luther King, comes and speaks. Everybody, they couldn't wait to come to this event. And so that connects to the black community and the music and the heritage of, Windsor being the end of the Underground Railroad, the terminal. Windsor and Amherstburg. Another great story that changed the world. We showed people how we could get along and how important it was for us to get rid of this terrible behavior. It was not easy, believe me. It was not easy for them to have the Emancipation Day Festival. They went through a lot of terrible racism. So, we look at that as part of, that's the earlier story to the CKLW story, as you say. Without Jackson Park, they probably don't get to meet Berry Gordy's sister. I can't remember her name. I know her last name was Edwards, so I should know that part. I can't remember her name. She became a huge fan. And because, the Gordy family they operated like a bank. They took care of each other. Like, they put the money up for Motown. They all came here, and they loved it. So, wow, world class, eh?
Oh, yeah.
World class story. Emancipation, freedom seekers, Underground Railroad, setting up a black community here, Walter Perry decides to have the Emancipation Day Festival, all the turbulence he had to go through, all the trials and tribulations, gets this festival up and running hugely, gets all these acts here, not just acts, I mean huge parade, food, incredible. Then, unfortunately, you have the riots, the uprising of '67, which brings that old racism back, and now they can't have the festival anymore because evidently it's going to be too dangerous to have all these people around. It's just stupid. But that's what happens, The old fears come back out. Now you've got the end of the Emancipation Day Festival in '67. It couldn't really get it back up in '68, and you lose something very important, I think. People have tried to revive it over time, but it's really hard. Really hard. And then the Freedom Festival, the International Freedom Festival, comes in and really literally steals their name. Literally steals the name, and now these poor people who have been trying to have their festival feel like their festival's being taken away from them. So yeah, that's a whole nother story. We find out, the story that's not told in history. So here we are.
I wanted to ask you about, for example, in the book, you chronicle some places that, many places that no longer exist. Just some examples right off the bat. Tiger Stadium, Detroit, and, really significant events taking place like the World Series 68 game. And even like some stuff we could see right from our waterfront in Windsor, the Detroit Harbor Marine Terminal, the Boblo Island lettering,
Good one.
Thanks. And then, it's more of an early 20th century example, but the Ford Motor Company Canada Plant 1.
Plant 1.
Yeah, producing cars right on the foot of the river. And it's interesting, right? Because sometimes it's a little bit harder to tell those stories because you kind of look around like what's there presently, and it's barely anything of what was. So I was kind of curious, as as a writer, of this book and this exhibit, what is the feeling of a sense of responsibility to the historical record to make sure to document these spaces and these memories?
Yeah, well, if you just take the river as what we had and what we lost as an example, when you tear something down, you forget what was there really fast. Your mind has trouble remembering what that place looked like. If you put a photo there, then your mind fills in the blank. And we've done that throughout the city. There are plaques. Let's take the site we're on it right here. So we're on the river. This was the British American Brewing Company. And this was a massive operation. There was actually streets here that don't exist anymore in this block from, where are we, Church to Bruce, right? And then Riverside to Chatham. All of that was a brewery at one time. British American Brewery, founded by a Detroiter. He came over here to launch a brewery. So they had the waterfront as well as their dock. And so when you take that and that's gone, you can't remember what it looks like anymore. So when we did the book Before and After, Windsor Before and After, that's the thing that we talked about, is that your mind plays tricks on you. You can't remember what it looked like once it's gone. It's always part of your life until it's not. But then something else is there, and your mind can't fill it in. But when you see the photo, you go, and that's the response we get. So take across the street used to be the Holiday Inn. People, when they look at the photo, always say the same thing. Oh, my God, that was the Holiday Inn. The Ford Plant 1 on the water, they actually built out onto the water. They filled in the land. So when you see it being constructed, you realize they came out about almost 100 feet into the water. All gone. We can do many other examples. The railroad tracks from Willette all the way down to Walker Road, all gone. We can't remember what they looked like. There used to be a roundhouse there where they turned the trains around. Go further down the river, and, I'm just trying to think of a few more. In the Detroit side, there used to be the Fort Wayne, Hotel Wayne, where Cobo Hall is. That was the terminal for the boats, the cruise ships. Tiger Stadium. Everybody of a certain age from Windsor, they went to Tiger Stadium as a kid, man. That really stayed in your brain, but now it's gone. We can look across the river, and we can now see the Michigan Central Station all redone. But that was a big, ugly-ass hulk for a long time, But now we can save that. You mentioned the Boblo Terminal. I documented that thing being torn down. That was the largest warehouse on the Great Lakes when it was built.
Wow.
Yeah, and half of it was refrigerated so they could bring in fruit and vegetables and things. Big sign, Boblo. Now it's gone. We can't remember what it's like when it was there. There's other buildings along the way. The Seven Sisters, the Detroit Edison electric power plant. The coal-generated power plant it was a landmark on the river. You could see it from miles away, and that's how you could use your direction to get to the Detroit River. So that's gone. They tore that down. I mean, you go up and down the river, and once they're gone, you can't remember what was there. That's just the way the brain is. And so that's why we like documenting this stuff and trying to find these photos. We got a whole section on resorts that used to be along the river. It was shocking how many there were, and can't find a book about it anywhere. As hard as I try, there might be something, but there's no book about their great resorts that used to be along the river. Boblo, another example. Boblo, I think you can see that one a little better in your mind, because as a kid, you had the wild mouse and you had the tower, and you could see it coming in. But really, when I look at, there's a lot of video now coming on, and you look at it and you go, wow, is that what it was like? It seems so different when you were a kid, So, yeah, you're right, the disappearing landscape. And I think disappearance is part of our whole existence, When you go to Europe and you really see how long the buildings last over there compared to ours, 100 years is considered a long time, but over there it could be 600, 700, 800 years. So it's a big difference in terms of mentality. Detroit has more than Windsor, but they've lost a lot too. They're talking about taking down the Renaissance Center. How weird would that be to look at the skyline and not have that big tower anymore?
Oh yeah.
So that's kind of where we're at with all that stuff. Yeah.
Well, now's the time I'm going to just give you the opportunity. If that's pretty much my questions for you, but if there's anything I didn't ask you specifically you want to mention about the book or the exhibit, please feel free.
I think in summary, if you could just summarize, what we get out of this is that we get this unique relationship, not just in North America, but in the world. 2 cities, 2 countries, a lot of times 2 languages, especially, when it was French and English more, and all the intertwined relationships. How many people from Detroit are connected to Windsor, and how many people from Windsor are connected to Detroit, and how much our livelihood and our existence is based on each other, not on very unique in the world. So I like to say we're bound by history, right? We're divided by water, but we're joined together in spirit. We are joined together. And I think we feel it more in Windsor than they do in Detroit. And I think that's because Detroit had the mass migration to the suburbs. So they don't feel the river the way they used to. They don't feel that connection. But if you go back 2 generations, come back in to the city, say before 1950 especially, World War II, the connections are so strong between us. So that's why we call it a river runs between us, because it does run between us, but it joins us as well. So that was our focus, and I think we've accomplished that task to kind of highlight this unique history in the world, not just, in this part of the world. And that it's a bigger story. I tried to explain that in this presentation today.
Yeah.
That's it, yeah.
So thanks so much for your time. Thank you.
I appreciate the interview. You did a good job. I loved your questions.
Thanks.
Yeah, it was really good. Thanks.